Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Ivy. I work for the Southern Conservation Trust, and today, for a little fun side project, I'm going to teach you guys a little bit about banjos. This idea came about because we just got our new nature center in Fayetteville as an antebellum home built in the 1800s, and with that we talked about a lot about history that's being passed down. And it's really cool to kind of live through that history and be able to have an antebellum home as an office. And between all the stuff that we found there, one of the interesting things that was left at the house was this banjo. While this banjo is not truly an antique, it is created to look like one. And the prior owner of our house was a gentleman that enjoyed playing the banjo, and I myself enjoy playing the banjo. And it's one of those things about history that we like to pass down traditions. And I feel like the banjo is a tradition that not very many people have passed down in their families, but mine definitely has. My dad played the banjo and got his first one when he was like 15 years old, and that got me interested in banjo as well. And just being able to see that passion for something like that when we moved into our new office was really incredible to me. So I picked up this banjo and keep it in my office and play it, and just as an homage to the gentleman that used to live there and to the long, strong history of the banjo in the United States. A lot of people associate the banjo with American music because it has been a staple with American music for centuries. But the banjo did not start as an American instrument. It actually started in Africa. A lot of people don't know that. With an instrument called, I'm going to murder this, but I think the akonting. And the akonting was this instrument. It was essentially a gourd with an animal skin stretched over the top of it, very tightly, with a long stick, almost like this fretboard, with a few different strings on it. And it was played similar to what we call the claw hammer style of banjo. As it originated in Africa, during the slave trade, it made its way to the U.S. and was a slave instrument for a long time. And then kind of towards the 1800s, 19th century, it became more popular as minstrel shows and things like that began. And then this instrument is a model of one of those banjos, is almost one of the first commercially made banjos. And we notice a modern banjo. We have the stretched skin across the top, like that animal skin was on that African instrument, but it's more like a drum. You can kind of hear it. This banjo head is tightened over this pot. You can see this, the shell or the pot of the banjo is this rim, and then the head is stretched over that with a tension hoop, and then you have these brackets that tighten that tension hoop over the top, and that gives that just resonant sound. This is a 5-string fretless banjo, which means there aren't little metal bars that allow you to play different notes. So you have to kind of find your way up the fretboard. So I'm going to play this a little bit in the claw hammer style of banjo, kind of old-time banjo, but you can kind of hear the bridge on this banjo is a little thin, and I'll lose a string here and there. But just kind of give you an idea of this older style of banjo. So moving on, this is an open back banjo. This is typically what you would see. Moving on from its predecessor, the fretless banjo, we've still got the tightened skin head on top. We've got a few more brackets, a little nicer hardware. It looks a lot nicer. We also have added frets onto this banjo and beautiful inlay work. So this is mother of pearl inlaid into the fretboard, kind of as position markers, so you can kind of see where you're playing and where you need to move your fingers. This is very reminiscent of a guitar, except instead of 6 strings, we continue to have 5. We have 4 strings that go upward, and then you have this drone string on top that's tuned to a G. Most banjos are tuned to open G, so there's your G chord, C chord, D chord. But these banjos were played in the style of claw hammer, typically, and that's what they are reminiscent of today. When I say claw hammer, I mean I've got my hand kind of cupped like this, and I'm playing with the back of my fingernail, so either my index finger or my middle finger, and I'm using my thumb to play that drone string right there, so you can kind of get an idea. talking about, how the banjo was popularized. There's a guy named Uncle Dave Macon that was a very famous old-time banjo player, and he lived from the 1870s, about 1952. And he kind of was the bridge between 19th century music and 20th century music, especially on the banjo, and was one of the first big stars of the Grand Ole Opry. But what Dave Macon did is he laid a legacy for people in the 50s and 60s to really pick up the banjo and for it to become a popular instrument. During that time, also, a guy named Pete Seeger wrote a book on five-string banjo and was also a folk musician and popularized a playing technique similar to clawhammer, and then a two-finger style technique as well. But during that, these, open back banjos were popular, and then there were also banjos called resonator banjos, which we'll get into in just a second. But I just want to play one more piece for you on the open back banjo and a little alternate tuning. So as we move on in banjo history, we get into the 50s and 60s, and by this time a guy named Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys had started playing a type of folk music and country music that was birthed and termed bluegrass after the name of that band. And bluegrass music has evolved over time, but there's one very important cataclysmic event in bluegrass music in that time that changed the history of banjo forever. A guy by the name of Earl Scruggs came on the scene. He's from North Carolina and grew up playing the banjo from a very young age, and he kind of developed this technique from learning from some of his heroes in town, a three-finger style technique of banjo. I'll hold my fingers out. You can see that my fingers have these nice metal pieces on them. These are called finger picks and thumb pick. And Earl Scruggs developed this style of playing, kind of codified three-finger picking. So you think of modern day banjo sounds, and you can thank Earl Scruggs for that. So you kind of developed that rolling style. Thinking of a song like Cripple Creek that I played on the clawhammer banjo would be. So Earl Scruggs was in a band. He played with Bill Monroe for a little bit, but he was in a band called Flatt and Scruggs with Lester Flatt, and they had their own kind of Grand Ole Opry television show where they would come on and play this bluegrass music, and Earl would show off his skills on the banjo, and that kind of popularized banjo even more, because if you remember a song that was the opening to a television show called the Beverly Hillbillies. Did that. Flatt and Scruggs did that song. Earl played banjo and Lester Flatt sang that tune for the opening, and that kind of opened the eyes to a lot of people to banjo music for the first time, including some of today's greatest banjo players, including Bela Fleck is one that I can think of that just really was driven by the Ballad of Jed Clampett. Alright, so we talked about open back banjos and clawhammer banjo. And we talked a little about Earl Scruggs and bluegrass, but I'm going to explain to you the difference between an open back banjo and a bluegrass resonator banjo. So as you notice, there's another piece here, a couple more pieces. And what this does, this is called a resonator. And this is a maple resonator. And what it does is it pushes that sound that comes from the inside of this drum outward. So it projects it out, and you can see all these holes. This is called a flange, this metal piece here. And what it does is it pushes that sound back out at you. So it may be a little louder, and you may be able to notice that as I play. But bluegrass music, hey bear. Bluegrass music is a little different and a little bit more punchy. And just, play a couple songs that Earl Scruggs has done that are familiar. So there were a number of players that came on the scene after Earl Scruggs exploded the banjo world. And one of those I was talking about, Bela Fleck, Tony Trischka, a guy named Bill Keith was also prevalent in teaching some new banjo styles, especially the melodic style that characterized kind of more fiddle tunes and playing the melody instead of just those droning rolls. And that's kind of where I came on the scene with the banjo. My dad grew up in the 1970s in Meridian, Mississippi, and he loved that sound of the banjo. And for his 15th Christmas, my grandparents bought him a banjo. It was a cheaper, Korean-made banjo, but that was what I learned on. And in the whole sense of passing down traditions, a lot of people pass down traditions in their family, and I was very thankful that mine were musical and musical instruments. And for my dad's 40th birthday, we did something real special for him. He went down to a luthier shop. If you're not familiar with that term, a luthier is an instrument builder in South Mississippi, to meet a man named M.B. Green. And Mr. Green built banjos, and Dad special ordered a banjo from him, and this is the banjo I'm playing right now. So this banjo is a little different than typical banjos. You can tell looking at it that it's handmade, especially the inlay and things like that. Surprisingly, a lot of banjos are made out of mahogany and maple. This banjo, while this area here is made out of maple, has a sycamore neck on it, which is something that I'd only seen on this banjo but have heard of in the past. But this is an heirloom instrument. My dad allows me to play it, and I'll gladly play it and pass it along to my children. Hopefully they'll pick up this banjo bug that we all have. And while my banjo career is short, very young, I plan to continue to work on this till the day I die, because it is absolute joy, and I'm very thankful that my dad poured into me this tradition that is something that somewhat, I don't think it's dying, because there's this whole community of banjo players in the United States, and we may be fewer and far between, but a very tight-knit group. So thank you for watching today. We appreciate you guys tuning in for our virtual education. I know this isn't necessarily nature-based, but it's something we're really interested in, and we're thankful for living history and traditions that will carry on so that our great-grandchildren will enjoy things, especially nature, and more so right now. I hope that my great-grandchildren can pick the banjo. So thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it. Bye.